In January of 1874, in a quiet farmhouse in North Carolina, two brothers were found dead in the same bed. Bound together from birth, Chang and Eng Bunker had lived their entire lives as one body shared by two men. When one finally died, the other followed within hours, trapped in terror beside his brother's corpse. This is their story, a journey from Siam to the world's freak shows, from marriage and fatherhood to scandal, exploitation, and the grotesque fascination that haunted them in life and in death. The world called them monstrous, but the truth is far more complicated and far more unsettling. If stories like this haunt you as much as they haunt us, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record. And before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? In the year 1811, in the small fishing village of Meklong in Siam, now modern-day Thailand, a mother went into labor under a humid sky that pressed down on the thatched roofs of her community. It was not her first child, but this birth was unlike anything the family or the village midwives had ever seen. When the cries finally filled the air, they were not the cries of one infant, but two, and the women present gasped at the sight. The babies were joined at the chest by a thick band of flesh and cartilage, a permanent tether binding them together for life. Their mother, Nok, held them in trembling arms. Her relief at their survival mingled with fear of what such a birth meant. In early 19th century Siam, difference was rarely met with compassion. The twins' arrival was seen as an omen, a sign of supernatural imbalance, a disruption of what should have been a natural order. The villagers whispered in hushed tones. Some believed the twins were a curse, sent as punishment for sins unspoken. Others thought they were a blessing twisted into strangeness, a test from unseen spirits. A few saw them as something to be feared, carriers of ill fortune whose presence might invite disaster upon the whole village. Even as newborns, the boys were caught between two worlds, viewed not as children first, but as symbols of something unnatural. Their father, a fisherman hardened by years at sea, tried to brush off the superstition, yet he, too, could not ignore the looks that followed them, nor the murmurs that spread through the market and the temple alike. Still, the infants lived, and that alone was extraordinary. Many believed they would not survive a single night, that their fused bodies would collapse under the strain of shared life. But as days turned into weeks, the twins grew stronger, their cries loud and insistent, their limbs wriggling with vigor. Their mother clung to them with a protective fierceness, shielding them from the eyes of neighbors who crossed themselves or muttered prayers at the sight of her sons. She named them Chang and Eng, words meaning left and right, simple markers that reflected their mirrored existence. Yet survival did not erase the unease that hung over them. In Siam, where spirituality and daily life were bound tightly together, their very existence seemed to blur the line between the natural and the supernatural. To some, they were children of misfortune. To others, they were wonders not to be touched. But to everyone, they were different, and difference was dangerous. As Chang and Eng grew through infancy, the weight of superstition pressed more heavily upon their family. In Meklong, where rice fields stretched into the horizon and fishing boats dotted the riverbanks, life was ruled as much by belief as by necessity. Children born with deformities were whispered about, sometimes hidden, sometimes left to fate. The twins were too conspicuous to conceal. Every trip their mother made into the market was accompanied by stares, prayers muttered under breath, or the deliberate turning away of eyes. Some villagers insisted the boys should not have been allowed to live, that their survival itself was an offense against nature. Others avoided them altogether, fearful that even a glance could invite misfortune into their own homes. Their mother, Nok, carried them with quiet defiance. She shielded them with cloth, though no fabric could disguise the way they leaned into one another, joined forever at the chest. Her determination kept them alive during fevers, storms, and shortages, yet she could not protect them from the words spoken when backs were turned. Families crossed themselves when the twins passed by, and children were told not to play near them. For the brothers, awareness of their difference came early. They were stared at, pointed to, and spoken about as though they were not human children, but strange animals to be observed from a distance. Still, they thrived. Unlike the fragile infants villagers predicted would die, Chang and Eng grew sturdy and restless. By the time they could walk, their movements were awkward but determined. They learned quickly to coordinate, to compromise, to give and take in the rhythm of every step. What might have seemed impossible became ordinary for them. Two boys running, falling and rising again, tethered but never defeated. The same bond that made them objects of fear also gave them resilience. And yet, the stronger they became, the stronger the whispers grew. Illness in the village was blamed on them, storms on the river were said to be their curse, and accidents in the fields became further proof that their existence had upset the natural balance. The twins became scapegoats, living explanations for the misfortunes of others. Nock tried to silence the rumors, to insist her sons were no different than any others, but even her strength faltered when priests spoke of unnatural births as signs of divine displeasure. Chang and Eng were children, but they were never allowed innocence. Every step into the world reminded them that they were viewed as something outside of it, something that did not belong. Childhood for Chang and Eng was a constant negotiation between survival and suspicion. By the time they reached 5 years old, their coordination had become remarkable. What began as stumbling steps evolved into fluid motion, the boys learning to walk side by side as if guided by a single mind. They ran along the riverbanks, fetched water, and even helped with small chores, their bond forcing them into perfect synchronicity. To strangers, it looked unnatural. To them, it was simply life. They knew no other way. Despite the stigma, the twins displayed a spark that drew quiet fascination. Some villagers who had once feared them began to watch from a distance, captivated by how the boys adapted to what seemed impossible. When Chang reached for a basket, Eng compensated for the pull. When Eng tripped, Chang steadied him. They were two, but they functioned as one, a living demonstration of balance forged by necessity. Curiosity flickered where fear once dominated, though rarely did it soften into acceptance. Most still crossed themselves as they passed, muttering prayers that the twins' presence would not disturb the order of things. For the brothers themselves, awareness of being different grew heavier with age. Other children played freely in the fields, climbing trees and chasing each other, while Chang and Eng were kept apart. Parents discouraged their sons and daughters from mingling with them, claiming it was for safety, though the real fear was contagion of misfortune. The twins learned quickly that they would always be a spectacle, even at home. They began to sense the hush that fell when they entered a room, the deliberate distance neighbors kept, and the way adults stared longer than they should. Yet within the confines of their family, they thrived. Their mother instilled resilience, reminding them daily that their lives were worth as much as anyone else's. She insisted they learn discipline, work ethic, and self-reliance. She taught them to fish, to balance loads across their shoulders, and to navigate the narrow paths of their village with confidence. The boys, in turn, developed a fierce loyalty to each other, an unspoken pact that they would face every challenge together. It was a bond beyond mere brotherhood, a survival instinct cemented in blood and bone. But the village never let them forget they were different. Stories began to circulate beyond Meklong, traveling with merchants who spoke of the twin boys joined as one. As those whispers spread into surrounding provinces, curiosity grew, and with it the likelihood that the twins' lives would soon be drawn into a world far larger and far more merciless than their quiet village. The turning point in Chang and Eng's lives came not from their neighbors, but from the eyes of an outsider. In 1824, when the twins were 13, a Scottish merchant named Robert Hunter passed through Meklong on business. He had lived in Siam for years, trading along the rivers and coastlines, and his sharp eye sought not only goods, but opportunities. When he first glimpsed the boys swimming in the river, their movements synchronized like mirror images, he stopped and stared. Word had reached him already of strange children in the village, but to see them alive, strong, and moving in harmony was more startling than rumor. To Hunter, they were not children. They were spectacle. Hunter approached the family, presenting himself as a man of curiosity, even of science. He offered small gifts, spoke of wonders beyond Siam, and hinted that the boys could become more than the objects of suspicion in their village. What he truly saw was profit. In Europe and America, exhibitions of the unusual drew enormous crowds, and the conjoined twins were unlike anything most audiences had ever witnessed. Hunter pressed his case, telling the parents that their sons could be famous, that their lives could bring wealth instead of whispers. To a struggling family, the offer carried both promise and danger. Nok hesitated. She loved her sons fiercely, but she also knew their future in Siam would never be free of fear and suspicion. What if Hunter's promises of opportunity could shield them from a life of scorn? Their father, weary from years of labor, considered the merchant's arguments more practically. If the world wanted to see them, why not let the world pay? And so, reluctantly, the parents consented to allow Hunter to oversee their son's travels, not knowing the depth of exploitation that lay ahead. Hunter wasted no time. He arranged papers and permissions through the Siamese court, negotiating rights as if the twins were cargo to be shipped. Soon after, Chang and Eng were taken from their village, leaving behind the riverbanks of Meklong for the first time. They would never again belong wholly to their home. For Hunter, the twins were a ticket to fortune. For the boys, the voyage ahead would strip them of innocence, transforming them into curiosities for a paying world. The whispers of their village would be replaced by the roar of crowds, but those crowds would stare with the same unease, only louder. When the arrangements were complete, Chang and Eng were placed under the supervision of Robert Hunter and an American sea captain named Abel Coffin, who would transport them abroad. For the twins, leaving Siam was not merely leaving a village, it was abandoning the only world they had ever known. The humid air of Meklong, the smell of river mud, the chants of the temple bells, all of it fell behind as they were led onto a vessel bound for lands they could scarcely imagine. Their mother wept as they boarded, pressing charms into their hands, murmuring prayers for protection. The boys clung to her briefly before being urged forward, their tether pulling them together as they crossed into a future dictated not by choice but by contract. The voyage itself was a harsh education. The twins, unused to the ceaseless rocking of the sea, suffered sickness and confinement. Sailors regarded them with curiosity, some treating them with coarse amusement, others with a kind of awe. Even in the cramped quarters of the ship, they were stared at as if they were less passengers than cargo. Whispers circled among the crew. What kind of life did such children live, and what future awaited them in the world beyond Siam? For Chang and Eng, every glance was a reminder that they were no longer simply boys. They were already becoming a commodity. When the ship reached Calcutta, the first great city they had ever seen, the twins caught glimpses of crowded markets, towering buildings, and throngs of people who paused in astonishment at their passage. The response was the same as in their village, but magnified, fascination laced with unease. Wherever they went, eyes followed. The boys quickly learned that their lives were no longer private. They were an exhibit, whether on stage or simply walking through the streets. From India, their journey continued across oceans to Britain, the heart of empire and the epicenter of scientific inquiry and entertainment alike. Hunter and Coffin had no intention of easing them gently into this world. Instead, they planned to thrust the twins before paying audiences to turn their strangeness into profit. To the brothers, the voyage felt endless, a blur of salt water, foreign tongues, and the constant knowledge that they were being prepared for something they did not yet understand. Behind them lay the familiarity of Meklong, now unreachable. Before them stretched an unknown world that would name them, define them, and never again allow them to be only Chang and Eng. By the time Chang and Eng arrived in London, the world was already eager to see them. Posters announced their presence as if they were curiosities shipped from a distant land, rather than young men barely into their teens. The advertisements promised a spectacle beyond imagination. The Siamese Twins, it read, a living wonder from the East. From the moment they were led into crowded halls, the twins realized what their new life would be. The room hushed as they entered, all eyes drawn to the band of flesh that bound them at the chest. Some gasped openly, others murmured prayers, and still others leaned forward with hungry fascination. For the audience, the twins were not people, but a revelation of the strange and unnatural. At each exhibition, they were made to walk, turn, and move together so the crowd could see the unnatural unity of their bodies. They were asked to bend, to stretch, to perform the most ordinary actions, which under the gaze of hundreds became extraordinary. Chang, bolder and sharper in temperament, often stared defiantly at those who gawked, while Eng carried a quieter expression, his discomfort visible in the way he lowered his gaze. Yet neither could escape the stares, the laughter, or the whispered speculation. Doctors and scholars, too, came forward to examine them. Medical men crowded the front rows, sketching their forms, jotting notes, debating aloud whether they were truly two individuals or one soul divided. Some insisted on probing at the flesh that connected them, pressing fingers into the tissue as though the brothers were objects rather than living boys. Chang often swatted their hands away in irritation, while Eng endured in silence. The physicians spoke of separation, of experiments, of dissection after death, discussions that unfolded as if the twins were not standing there, listening. The newspapers quickly joined the frenzy. Columns described the curious prodigies from Siam, marveling at their coordination and speculating on how they could live ordinary lives. Some praised their sturdiness and intelligence, while others portrayed them as grotesque, nature's mistake dressed in Eastern clothing. The tone was fascination tinged with repulsion, admiration blurred with mockery. For Chang and Eng, the exhibitions were humiliating and exhausting. Yet, they were also a kind of initiation. The boys understood now that they were trapped between two identities, brothers and performers, men and monstrosities. Every audience confirmed the truth they could not escape. To the world, they would never simply be human. They would forever be the Siamese Twins. The exhibitions drew not only the curious public, but also the sharpest medical minds of the day, each eager to claim authority over the riddle of the twins. Physicians, anatomists, and philosophers filed into halls where Chang and Eng were displayed, their eyes narrowing as they studied the fleshy band that bound the brothers together. To the medical establishment, they were not simply a wonder. They were a puzzle waiting to be solved. Some argued they were nothing more than a deformity of the womb, a freak accident of biology. Others whispered that their existence challenged the very definition of individuality. Were Chang and Eng two men or one man, doubled in flesh? The debates grew intense. Some doctors insisted they must share one soul, pointing to their synchronized movements as proof that something deeper bound them beyond the physical. Others countered that their differing personalities, Chang bold and quick-tempered, Eng cautious and reflective, proved that they were distinct. The discussion spilled into theology, with preachers warning that if the brothers shared a soul, they would one day face judgment as a single being. Yet if they were separate, then why had God fused them so? To many, the very sight of the twins blurred the boundaries of creation. Proposals grew more grotesque. A few surgeons suggested that they should be cut apart, not out of mercy, but curiosity. If they were separated, could one survive without the other? Could both? And if one died, what would happen to the soul of the other? Some spoke of dissecting them after death to solve the mystery once and for all, their words carrying the clinical coldness of men more interested in answers than in lives. Chang and Eng listened to these discussions with growing bitterness. Though they could not understand every word, they recognized the tone, the way doctors gestured at them as though they were specimens rather than people. The twins were never asked what they felt, never treated as boys with thoughts and fears. They were curiosities, their humanity stripped away beneath the weight of questions that saw them not as individuals, but as an anomaly. For the brothers, the message was clear. The world's fascination with them was inseparable from its cruelty. Whether seen as one soul trapped in two bodies, or as monsters who defied the natural order, they were never permitted to simply be children growing into men. They were objects to be studied, judged, and forever displayed. After London, the next stage of their journey carried Chang and Eng across the Atlantic to America, where curiosity for the unusual was thriving. In cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, broadside posters announced their arrival in bold letters. The Siamese Twins, living wonders of nature. Audiences poured into theaters and lecture halls, eager to see the spectacle firsthand. For many Americans, they were not simply a curiosity from across the ocean. They were proof that the world was still filled with mysteries waiting to be uncovered. The exhibitions followed a familiar routine. The brothers would walk across a stage, bow, and demonstrate how they could move independently yet remain bound as one. They lifted objects, bent forward and back, even performed small athletic feats to show their surprising agility. Crowds gasped and applauded, children pointed in amazement, and whispers rippled through the audience at every turn. At times, they were made to bare their torsos so the audience could examine the fleshy band that joined them, as if their bodies were property for inspection. Alongside the public performances came lectures delivered by physicians and showmen alike, each presenting the twins as a marvel of both science and entertainment. Some described them as evidence of God's mysterious power, others as mistakes of nature preserved for study. The contradictions did not matter. What mattered was the attention, the ticket sales, the fascination that kept crowds returning. Yet beneath the applause lingered unease. The brothers were treated less as men than as spectacles of the grotesque. Newspaper articles described them with a mix of admiration and disgust, marveling at their coordination while speculating on the unnaturalness of their lives. Cartoonists sketched them with exaggerated features, mocking their tether as though it were a costume. Rumors spread freely. Were they able to feel the same pain, to think the same thoughts, to dream the same dreams? And more prurient whispers asked what might happen if they married, or if they fathered children, a fascination as intrusive as it was cruel. For Chang and Eng, the tours were exhausting. They were paraded from city to city, audience to audience, their lives dictated by contracts and managers who saw only profit. Nights were spent in cramped quarters, days on display before strangers who questioned their humanity aloud. Yet the brothers endured, adapting as they always had, moving together with resilience born from necessity. What none of the crowds knew was that the twins were already planning a future beyond exhibition, a life not as objects of wonder, but as men determined to live on their own terms. Years of constant display began to wear down Chang and Eng, not only in body but in spirit. Though still in their teens, they had spent the better part of their lives shuffled from stage to stage, paraded as living curiosities. The managers who controlled their contracts grew wealthy, while the brothers received little beyond board and meagre allowances. They understood, perhaps earlier than expected, that they were not partners in these exhibitions, but property. And the realization burned. Chang, the more outspoken of the two, often muttered complaints about their treatment. He resented being handled like a possession, ordered about, and forced to endure the poking fingers of physicians and the gawking of crowds. Eng, quieter but no less aware, agreed with his brother, though he counseled patience. Together they spoke of freedom, of the possibility that they might one day break from their handlers and earn for themselves. Their conversations, held in the privacy of their shared existence, were the seeds of rebellion. Opportunity came in the form of experience. Having endured endless exhibitions, the brothers had learned the mechanics of the business, how tickets were sold, how audiences were drawn, and how publicity could magnify their fame. They saw that it was not magic that made the crowds come, but careful promotion and control of their image. Slowly, they realized they could manage these things themselves. They did not need Hunter or Coffin to dictate their futures. They had become their own attraction, and with that came leverage. By 1829, when their contract with Hunter and Coffin neared its end, the brothers refused to renew. It was a decision met with outrage, but they were resolute. They declared themselves independent performers, taking charge of their own exhibitions. It was a daring move for young men still navigating a foreign land, but it proved transformative. Without middlemen siphoning profits, the twins quickly amassed wealth. They booked their own appearances, negotiated their own terms, and ensured that the money flowed into their pockets rather than those of their exploiters. The decision marked the first true shift in their lives. No longer passive subjects of exhibition, they became entrepreneurs. Crowds still stared, doctors still debated their souls and bodies, but the brothers now stood with a measure of dignity, men directing their own fate. Independence did not erase the humiliation of being treated as curiosities, but it gave them power, and that power would allow them to dream of lives beyond the stage, of homes, families, and legacies of their own making. With financial independence secured and their fame firmly established, Chang and Eng turned their thoughts toward lives beyond exhibition. They had traveled for years, endured countless stares, and grown weary of living only as performers. What they longed for was the respectability of home and family, a chance to be treated as men rather than marvels. In the American South, where they had settled during their tours, that desire would lead them into the most controversial chapter of their lives. It began in Wilkes County, North Carolina, where the twins encountered the Yates family. Among them were two sisters, Adelaide and Sarah. The brothers were captivated. For Chang, fiery and impulsive, affection for Adelaide came quickly. Eng, more reserved, found himself drawn to Sarah. What might have seemed an ordinary courtship for other men became a matter of gossip the moment it began. Neighbors whispered that the idea of one set of conjoined twins marrying two sisters was unnatural, even obscene. How could such unions work? How could intimacy be possible? What kind of children might result? The questions were repeated endlessly, their tone dripping with judgment. The Yates family faced harsh criticism for entertaining the brothers' advances. Some accused the sisters of chasing notoriety, of being drawn to the scandal more than the men themselves. Others insisted it was immoral, an affront to God and nature. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of such unions, warning that they mocked the sanctity of marriage. But despite the outrage, Chang and Eng pressed forward. They were determined not to let the world dictate whom they could love, nor to let superstition rule their futures. In 1843, the marriages were performed in quiet ceremonies that did little to quiet the noise. Newspapers seized upon the story, reporting it with a mixture of sensationalism and disbelief. The couples were lampooned in cartoons, depicted in crude sketches that exaggerated the strangeness of their shared lives. To the public, the marriages were less about affection and more about spectacle. For the brothers, however, it was a declaration. They would live as husbands, not as curiosities. The scandal only deepened in the years that followed, as the twins and their wives established households together. Every gesture of domestic life, every meal shared, every child born, became fuel for gossip. Yet behind the whispers and ridicule, the brothers found a measure of what they had always sought. Lives of their own choosing, however unconventional they appeared to the rest of the world. If the weddings of Chang and Eng Bunker caused scandal, what followed was nothing short of an obsession. From the moment the ceremonies ended, neighbors and newspapers alike turned their attention to the question no one dared ask openly, but everyone whispered in private. How would two men fused at the chest consummate their marriages? The very idea became a subject of morbid fascination, a kind of voyeurism that transformed private unions into public curiosities. Cartoonists churned out crude illustrations of the couple's wedding night, mocking the notion of intimacy between the sisters and the conjoined brothers. Writers speculated on how the marriages could possibly function, whether the brothers shared not only their household, but their most private moments. Some took the cruelty further, suggesting that the wives had committed themselves to shame and sin, indulging desires that defied morality. In parlors and on street corners, the gossip grew louder, fueled by a mix of prurience and revulsion. Chang, fiery as ever, reacted with anger when confronted by the insinuations. He snapped at reporters, slammed doors in the faces of gawkers, and refused to explain what was no one's business but his own. Eng, quieter and more thoughtful, endured the scrutiny in silence, though his unease was clear. The sisters, too, bore the brunt of ridicule. Adelaide and Sarah were whispered about in church pews, shunned at gatherings, and accused of having sullied their reputations by binding themselves to men who could never be seen as ordinary. The irony was cruel. For years, the brothers had endured being treated as public property, paraded on stages and examined like specimens. Their marriages, which should have marked a turn toward private lives, only deepened the intrusion. What they had sought as a retreat from spectacle became another stage, one more lurid than any theatre they had ever stood upon. Yet behind the gossip and speculation, the brothers lived as husbands. They built homes, established households, and shared lives with their wives as any married men would, however unconventional their arrangements appeared from the outside. The world demanded to know the mechanics of their intimacy, but the brothers offered no answers. In that silence, the rumors only grew. To their neighbors, the Bunker household was not simply unusual. It was a scandalous mystery, and one they would never stop trying to unravel. Life inside the Bunker household soon settled into a rhythm that was at once ordinary and extraordinary. The brothers divided their time between two homes, one with Adelaide, the other with Sarah, rotating every 3 days so that each wife had her share of privacy and companionship. To outsiders, it seemed a bizarre arrangement, a practical impossibility. Yet within those walls, the families adapted. Meals were shared, chores divided, and the twins, despite their tether, moved about the household as fathers, husbands, and providers. What the world dismissed as grotesque became, for them, the pattern of daily life. Chang remained the more forceful of the two, his temper quick, his habits stubborn. He enjoyed liquor more than his brother approved, and when he drank too heavily, the tension between them was plain. Eng, quieter and more measured, often tried to temper his brother's impulsiveness, reasoning with him when tempers flared. Their wives bore witness to these quarrels, caught in the strange position of sharing not only husbands, but the friction of two men bound together. Yet despite these conflicts, the households functioned. The brothers built furniture, worked the land, and oversaw the raising of their growing children. Neighbors, however, never stopped talking. To them, the arrangement was not only peculiar, but scandalous. They speculated endlessly about how the couples managed their private lives, whispered about the children who began to arrive, and clung to the idea that something unnatural was happening behind the shuttered windows. Every trip to town, every Sunday service carried the weight of curious eyes. The brothers, who had sought marriage and family as a retreat from spectacle, found instead that their domestic lives became yet another kind of exhibition. Only this time, the stage was gossip and rumor. Inside the household, though, bonds formed. Adelaide and Sarah, often caricatured as victims or accomplices, became determined partners in shaping their families. They defended their marriages against ridicule and raised their children with a fierce protectiveness that echoed their mother-in-law's devotion years before. The Bunker homes were filled with the sounds of laughter, arguments, chores, and play, no different from any other farmstead, except for the constant reality that two men, joined at the chest, occupied every room together. To outsiders, the household was a scandal that defied nature. To those within, it was simply life, lived one day at a time. The twins had succeeded in carving out something remarkable, a family of their own choosing, however strange the world believed it to be. In time, the most undeniable proof of the Bunker brothers' domestic lives came with the arrival of children. First one, then another, and soon many more. Adelaide and Sarah bore child after child until the combined number reached 21. The sight of so many offspring left neighbors stunned. It was one thing to whisper about the scandal of the marriages, it was another to confront the living evidence of them. For every child who toddled through the yard, for every infant cradled at a mother's breast, the gossip sharpened. The question the world had so crudely asked, how could such unions possibly be consummated, was now answered, though the mechanics remained hidden. Rumors spread with the force of wildfire. Some whispered that the births were unnatural, that the children were doomed to inherit deformities. When the children proved healthy, the whispers shifted. Were they truly fathered by the twins, or had some secret arrangement been made with other men? The cruelty of these suspicions hung over the household, poisoning the way neighbors regarded the family. Churchgoers muttered about sin, while physicians speculated endlessly about anatomy and possibility. Each child became another point of fascination, another opportunity for strangers to pry into the private lives of a family who had long been denied privacy. For Chang and Eng, the children were not symbols of scandal, but the truest measure of their success. They had sought family life to prove to themselves and to the world that they were more than curiosities. Their children represented proof that they could live as men, not as sideshow attractions. The twins doted on them, worked to provide for them, and carried the weight of fatherhood with pride. Though their tether bound them inescapably together, their devotion to their families was the same as any other father's. Inside the home, the children grew up with a kind of fierce loyalty to one another. Cousins played side by side like siblings, bound not only by blood, but by the strange legend that shadowed their name. They learned early that their family was not like others, that when they stepped beyond their gate, the world looked at them differently. Yet within the walls of the Bunker homesteads, they found the ordinary joys of play, learning, and belonging. To outsiders, the arrival of so many children only deepened the scandal. To the Bunkers themselves, it was nothing less than the fulfillment of the lives they had fought to claim. Against the whispers, against the ridicule, the family thrived. As the children grew and the Bunker household became firmly established, the scrutiny of the church grew sharper. For neighbors unsettled by the sight of two brothers, conjoined in flesh, living as husbands and fathers, the question was no longer only about scandal or curiosity. It became a matter of the soul. In an age when Scripture dictated morality as much as law, religious leaders could not ignore the unsettling presence of men whose very bodies seemed to blur the boundaries of creation. Were Chang and Eng two men, each with his own immortal soul? Or were they one divided being, condemned to face judgment as a single entity? The sermons began quietly, woven into passages about sin, unnatural unions, and the order of God's creation. Preachers avoided naming the brothers outright, yet the congregation knew well who was being addressed. Whispers in the pews turned into pointed glances, and the Bunker family felt the sting of moral judgment every Sunday. For some, the marriages were interpreted as evidence of lust unchecked, of women who had given themselves to monstrosity. For others, the very existence of the twins was read as a punishment visited upon humanity, a reminder of the world's corruption. The debate spilled into theological circles far beyond North Carolina. Pamphlets and religious tracts speculated on whether God could create two men joined in one body, and if so, what their fate might be in the afterlife. Some argued they would be judged as individuals, each carrying his own soul. Others, more damningly, declared they were a single creature, one soul split unnaturally in two bodies, a sign of divine displeasure, perhaps even a living warning. Such interpretations cast a shadow over their families, as though the innocence of their children could not erase the supposed sin of their father's very existence. Chang bristled at these judgments, his temper quick to flare when confronted by moral condemnation. Eng, more patient, sought to ignore it, though the weight of whispers never left him. The wives, Adelaide and Sarah, bore the burden silently, enduring cold stares and whispered prayers offered in their direction. For the Bunker family, faith should have been a sanctuary, yet it became another stage of ridicule. In the eyes of the church, they were not simply men, husbands, or fathers. They were a problem to be explained, a living riddle that could not fit neatly within doctrine. Even as the church wrestled with questions of the soul, the world of medicine refused to let go of its own fascination. From the time of their first exhibitions in London, doctors had debated the nature of their connection, and decades later, those debates had not faded. Physicians from across America and Europe traveled to North Carolina, some under the pretense of curiosity, others under the guise of compassion, to study the brothers. They came with notebooks, scalpels, and endless questions. What was the exact structure of the band of flesh that bound them? Did they share blood, or did each brother's body function independently? If one died, could the other survive? The speculation was relentless. Surgeons spoke of the possibility of separation, though the risks were staggering. Without anesthesia or sterile procedures, such an operation in the mid-1800s would have been nothing short of butchery. Yet that did not stop physicians from proposing it. Some declared that attempting to separate the brothers was a moral duty, a chance to grant them individual lives. Others admitted more grimly that the true motive was discovery, the chance to test the limits of medicine and to prove themselves pioneers. To many, the bunkers were not men, but an unprecedented opportunity for experimentation. Chang and Eng themselves rejected the notion. They had lived nearly 4 decades joined together, and they saw no reason to risk death on the gamble of a surgeon's ambition. Separation would not give them back the years they had already shared, nor erase the lives they had built with their wives and children. More importantly, they distrusted the motives of the doctors who spoke so eagerly of cutting them apart. Too often, those men seemed less interested in saving lives than in writing papers, in earning reputations that would outlive the brothers themselves. The fascination extended to what might be done after their deaths. Physicians whispered openly about dissection, about preserving the band of flesh in glass jars for study. Some even lobbied for the right to claim their bodies once they passed, arguing that their scientific value outweighed private grief. It was a grotesque reminder that even in life, their humanity had been overshadowed by curiosity. The brothers, aware of these discussions, grew guarded, wary of strangers who approached them with too much interest. They knew that when death finally came, their bodies might not be granted rest, but would instead be pried open under the cold gaze of science. Despite the endless curiosity of doctors and the condemnation of preachers, Chang and Eng managed to carve out a place for themselves in the American South. With the money they earned from exhibitions, and later through careful business dealings, the brothers invested in land. They purchased a plantation in Wilkes County, North Carolina, establishing themselves as farmers and, to the astonishment of many, as men of means. In a society where wealth was often equated with respectability, their success forced even their harshest critics to acknowledge them. They were no longer mere performers from abroad. They were landowners, husbands, and fathers presiding over sprawling households. The plantation flourished, worked by enslaved laborers whose lives remained bound in the brutal system that defined the antebellum South. Here lay one of the strangest contradictions of the Bunker brothers' story. Men who had themselves been objectified, treated as property, and paraded for profit now became masters in a society built on human bondage. They attended markets, managed their accounts, and lived in the paradox of being both victims of exploitation and participants in a system that thrived on it. Neighbors who once mocked them now envied their prosperity, though the whispers of their peculiarity never truly faded. The Bunkers lived comfortably, dividing their time between the homes they built for Adelaide and Sarah. Their children grew up surrounded by farmland, livestock, and the rhythms of southern life. Visitors to the plantation often remarked on the surprising normalcy of the households. Within those walls, meals were taken, prayers were spoken, and laughter of children echoed in the rooms. Scenes of ordinary family life, overshadowed by the extraordinary presence of 2 fathers joined at the chest. Yet even as their wealth grew, so did the unease of outsiders. Some neighbors viewed their prosperity as proof of uncanny luck, while others muttered that they had bargained with forces beyond human comprehension. The twins themselves dismissed these claims, focusing instead on the work of their land. Chang, hot-tempered and ambitious, often drove the business forward, while Eng tempered his brother's impulses with patience and calculation. Together they built not only a fortune, but a kind of uneasy respect in the community. Still, their wealth could not erase the stares or the sermons. They were tolerated as successful men, but never fully accepted as equals. To their neighbors, they remained curiosities, men who had clawed their way into respectability, yet could never escape the shadow of the flesh that bound them together. When the storm of the Civil War swept across America, the Bunker brothers found themselves caught in the same divisions that tore the nation apart. As plantation owners in North Carolina, their position placed them firmly in the South, yet their foreign origins and peculiar condition made their loyalty suspect in the eyes of both neighbors and officials. For a time, they managed to keep their distance from the conflict, continuing to work their land and care for their families. But war had a way of creeping into every household. In 1861, when the Confederacy declared secession, men across the South were called to arms. Whispers spread through Wilkes County. Would the Siamese Twins be conscripted? How could they fight when they could not be separated? Some mocked the idea, picturing them dragging rifles together across a battlefield, while others speculated whether one brother might be drafted while the other was forced to follow. The thought was grotesque, but in a time of desperation, even such absurdities were considered. The brothers themselves were anxious. Chang, fiery and impulsive, sympathized with the Confederate cause in part to secure his standing among Southern elites. Eng, more cautious, worried about what war might mean for their families and their future. Though they shared a body, their views diverged, fueling tension that neither could escape. Yet, despite the rumors and official murmurs, the matter of conscription was quietly dropped. The Confederate government, already overwhelmed with logistics, seemed unwilling to test the spectacle of putting the famous twins in uniform. The war, however, struck their lives in other ways. As with many planters, the conflict disrupted markets, drained resources, and left their plantation vulnerable. Enslaved people, hearing of the Union advance and emancipation proclamations, fled whenever they could, eroding the brothers' labor force and weakening their economic footing. Crops withered in neglected fields, debts mounted, and the prosperity they had carefully built began to crumble. For the twins, the war years were marked by anxiety and decline. Once celebrated for their wealth, they now felt the uncertainty that shadowed every Southern family as cannons thundered across the land. The contradictions of their lives became sharper than ever. Men who had been treated as curiosities now clung to the privileges of a collapsing society, hoping that when the war ended they might still find a place for themselves in a world that was changing faster than they could endure. When the Civil War finally ended in 1865, the Bunker brothers were left to confront a world that had shifted beneath their feet. Their plantations, once symbols of prosperity, now stood diminished. The emancipation of enslaved laborers, combined with years of wartime disruption, had gutted their workforce and crippled their economy. Where once fields stretched green and profitable, they now yielded little. The brothers, who had commanded wealth and even a degree of reluctant respect in their community, suddenly found themselves burdened with debts that grew heavier by the year. The strain was not only financial. Time, too, had begun to exact its price. By their 50s, both men bore the signs of hard living. Chang, ever hot-tempered and stubborn, had long indulged in drink. His dependence on alcohol worsened as the pressures of debt mounted, leaving him more irritable and often unsteady. Eng, the more moderate of the two, grew weary of his brother's habits, but what could he do? Bound together by the very flesh of their bodies, he was forced to share every stumble, every stagger, every hangover. What might have been a private vice for one man became a burden endured by two. The tension between them grew sharper. Arguments flared over money, over responsibilities, over Chang's drinking. Eng tried to reason with him, to coax him toward restraint, but Chang bristled at every attempt, insisting that he was his own man and could do as he pleased. Yet they both knew the cruel truth. Neither could live as his own man. Every choice made by one was borne by the other. That reality, once a bond that had sustained them, now deepened into a source of bitterness. Meanwhile, their children were growing, and with them came the expenses of feeding and clothing large families. The Bunker household, once envied for its size and prosperity, now felt the pinch of decline. Neighbors who had once whispered about their scandal now whispered about their misfortune, some with sympathy, others with quiet satisfaction. The once curious world no longer flocked to see them. They were aging men, no longer the wonders they had been in their youth. By the early 1870s, the Bunkers' bodies were failing. Chang's health, battered by strokes and weakened by alcohol, grew precarious. Eng carried the weight of his brother's decline, literally and figuratively, his own body suffering the strain of keeping them both upright. The brothers, once marvels of resilience, now stood at the edge of collapse, tethered as always, but with mortality closing in. The turning point came in the early 1870s, when Chang suffered a severe stroke. It struck without warning, leaving one side of his body weakened, his speech slurred, and his movements slow. For any man, it would have been a cruel blow, a signal of decline. For Chang, bound to his brother, it was more than a personal affliction. It became a sentence that Eng was forced to serve alongside him. From that day forward, Eng bore not only his own weight, but much of Chang's as well. Every step was harder, every task a negotiation. When Chang stumbled, Eng stumbled. When Chang sagged into exhaustion, Eng had no choice but to steady him. The tether between them, once a symbol of their shared strength, now became a chain of dread. Chang's frustration only deepened the misery. His pride, always fierce, refused to accept his weakness. He raged at his own body, cursed his frailty, and lashed out at Eng when patience wore thin. He continued to drink, though his body could no longer endure it. The liquor left him sicker, his gait more unsteady, his speech less clear. Eng, trapped by his brother's choices, could do nothing but endure. He pleaded with Chang to stop, to rest, to accept his limits, but Chang's defiance only sharpened. "I am my own man," he insisted, though both knew the bitter truth, that he was not, and never had been. For Eng, the stroke marked the beginning of a slow terror. Each night as they lay down to sleep, he wondered whether he would wake to find his brother dead beside him. The thought haunted him, a nightmare he could never escape. If Chang's heart gave out, what would become of him? Could he survive? Or would he be dragged into death by the very bond that had sustained them since birth? Doctors had long debated the question, but no one truly knew. Eng carried the dread in silence, the weight of inevitability pressing on him as surely as his brother's failing body leaned upon his shoulder. Neighbors noticed the change. Where once the brothers strode through town with steady rhythm, now their steps were uneven, labored. Whispers followed them again, not of scandal this time, but of decay. The spectacle they had once provided on stages across the world was now reduced to the somber sight of two aging men, one faltering, the other struggling to hold them both upright. Mortality, which they had defied for decades, was closing in, and there would be no escape. On the night of January 16th, 1874, the farmhouse in Mount Airy lay quiet under a pale winter moon. Inside, the brothers went to bed as they always had, side by side, tethered by the flesh that had bound them for more than 60 years. Chang, weakened by years of illness and drink, struggled to find rest. Eng, weary from the constant strain of supporting him, drifted into uneasy sleep, his mind heavy with the same thought that haunted him every night. What if tonight is the night? The following morning, Eng awoke to a silence more chilling than any nightmare. He turned and found his brother still, his face grey and his body cold. Chang was dead. The man who had raged against weakness, who had defied doctors, who had lived defiantly to the very end, had finally succumbed. For Eng, there was no moment of relief, only horror. He was not free of the tether. He was still bound to his brother's corpse. Panic coursed through him. He cried out for help, his voice trembling, neighbors rushing to the house as word spread that something was terribly wrong. They found Eng upright in the bed, pale and terrified, his brother's body still attached to his side. "I am dying too," he reportedly gasped, his eyes wide with dread. Whether his fear was born from shock or from the knowledge that his own body could not survive the strain of being bound to the dead, it was impossible to say. What was certain was the terror in his voice, the realization of a fate he had dreaded for years, now staring him in the face. Doctors were called, but nothing could be done. No surgery was attempted, no desperate measure taken. In those final hours, Eng remained conscious, aware, and utterly helpless. Every breath became heavier, his body weakening as his brother's lifeless weight dragged against him. There was no possibility of escape, no chance of separation. He had lived every moment of his life tethered to Chang, and now he would die tethered to him as well. By that afternoon, just 3 hours after Chang's death, Eng collapsed and followed him into silence. 2 lives ended in a single day, bound in death as in life. Neighbors who had once whispered of scandal now stood in stunned silence. What they had long speculated upon, the fate of one twin should the other die, was at last answered in the most tragic and inevitable way. In those dreadful hours between Chang's death and his own, Eng's suffering left a deep impression on all who witnessed it. Neighbors recalled how his face carried not only grief, but terror, his body trembling under the weight of his lifeless brother. He called out for help, though everyone present knew there was none to give. A doctor examined him, but the look in the man's eyes betrayed what his words did not. There would be no saving him. To cut him free now, without preparation or proper instruments, would be nothing short of butchery. The band of flesh that had once been so carefully examined by scholars now became a cruel shackle, ensuring Eng's fate. Witnesses described his voice as strained, his breathing labored, his words filled with fear. "I cannot last," he is said to have murmured, eyes fixed on the corpse of his brother beside him. The silence of Chang's body, the stillness of his face, became unbearable to Eng. For decades he had lived with his brother's every movement, every breath, every heartbeat. To feel nothing from him now was like carrying a phantom that dragged him down into darkness. The family gathered around him, their children and wives weeping as the inevitable unfolded. Adelaide and Sarah, who had borne years of public ridicule for their marriages, now faced the unbearable truth that their husbands were being taken from them together, as cruelly and suddenly as they had entered the world. No farewell could be given in private. The tether between the men made even death a shared ordeal. Hours crawled by. Eng's fear shifted into exhaustion, his body succumbing to weakness. By the afternoon of January 17th, less than 3 hours after Chang had passed, Eng's breathing grew shallow. His eyes fluttered closed, and he, too, was gone. The farmhouse fell silent once more, broken only by the sobs of those left behind. Two brothers, born together in strangeness, had died together in inevitability. For those who witnessed Eng's final hours, the image would never fade. A man bound to the corpse of his brother, waiting helplessly for death to claim him as well. It was the fulfillment of the grim question that had haunted them all. What would happen when one twin died? The answer was as tragic as it was inevitable. There could be no survival, no freedom. Where one went, the other followed. News of the twins' death travelled quickly, and before the bodies were even cold, physicians and men of science hurried to the farmhouse. For decades they had debated what would happen if one brother died before the other, and now the answer lay before them. But curiosity did not end there. Doctors, some arriving uninvited, saw an opportunity to confirm theories that had haunted medical circles since the brothers' youth. They demanded to examine the corpses, to cut into the band of flesh that had tied the men together from birth, to finally understand the mystery that had made them famous. The family, overcome with grief, could do little to shield their husbands and fathers from intrusion. Physicians hovered over the bodies, fingers pressing into the lifeless tissue, eyes gleaming with a mixture of fascination and ambition. Reports described how scalpels were drawn and the tether dissected, layer by layer. What had once been a symbol of unity, of survival against all odds, was now reduced to a specimen. The men who had lived, loved, worked, and raised families were once again stripped of humanity, transformed back into curiosities to be studied in death as they had been in life. The findings were dutifully recorded. The connecting band, it was revealed, contained fused livers with blood vessels that intertwined between them. The conclusion seemed obvious to the doctors. Separation in life might have been impossible without killing one or both. This fact was proclaimed with the air of discovery, though it offered little comfort to those who mourned the men. For the families, the dissection was not a triumph of science, but a desecration of dignity, their loved ones reduced to puzzles to be solved. Newspapers soon published sensational accounts of the examination. Readers devoured details of the autopsy, as though the deaths were merely the final act of a long performance. The twins had been born into superstition, lived under the gaze of crowds, and now, even in death, they could not rest in peace. The scalpel had rendered them open to the world once more, their bodies displayed not on a stage, but on the pages of medical journals and popular press. For those who had known them as husbands, fathers, and neighbors, the intrusion was a bitter reminder. Chang and Eng had fought for independence, carved out homes, and demanded to live as men. Yet in the end, the world claimed their bodies, ensuring that even in death they remained objects of fascination, forever denied the quiet dignity they had long sought. The day after their passing, newspapers across America blazed with headlines, "The Siamese Twins Dead." In bold type, their deaths were presented less as a tragedy for a family than as the sensational climax of a decades-long spectacle. Columns detailed the circumstances with morbid fascination, describing how Chang had died in his sleep and how Eng, still tethered to him, had lived for only a few hours before following. The accounts lingered on the horror of Eng's final moments, his cries of fear, his helplessness beside the corpse of his brother. Readers devoured these descriptions as if the men's suffering were nothing more than a story crafted for entertainment. Journalists went further, reporting not only on their deaths, but on the physicians who had dissected their bodies. Articles spoke of fused livers, of vessels that intertwined, of the scientific conclusions drawn from the grotesque examination. For editors, this detail was irresistible. It gave the narrative a veneer of education while feeding the public's appetite for the macabre. The twins were once again reduced to curiosities, their humanity buried beneath lurid detail. Illustrated weeklies published engravings of their bodies, sketches of their tether, diagrams showing the structure revealed in autopsy. For the public, many of whom had once paid admission to see the men in life, this was a second exhibition, one they could now consume from the safety of their parlours. What had begun in the village of Meklong as whispers of unnatural birth had ended in American newspapers as a grotesque anatomy lesson. Amid this frenzy, the brothers' families grieved in silence. Adelaide and Sarah, now widows, watched as their private sorrow was overshadowed by headlines. Their children, more than 20 in number, saw their fathers' lives reduced to a spectacle once more, their dignity stripped away by ink and press. What should have been a period of mourning was transformed into another act in a drama that seemed to have no end. Even in death, Chang and Eng were denied the peace of being remembered as men. Instead, they were framed as marvels extinguished, as puzzles solved, as curiosities finally laid bare. The world that had profited from their lives found profit in their deaths too, ensuring that the Bunker brothers remained what they had always been to outsiders, a story to be consumed rather than men to be mourned. When the doctors had finished their examinations and the newspapers had filled their columns, the bodies of Chang and Eng were finally returned to their families. The farmhouse that had been the scene of their final hours now became the place of farewell. Neighbours gathered, some out of respect, others out of morbid curiosity, to see the men who had lived and died in such extraordinary fashion laid to rest. There was little grandeur to the ceremony. The brothers had been famous across continents, but here in North Carolina their burial was simple, their graves dug in the red earth of the countryside they had come to call home. Family members wept openly as coffins were lowered into the ground, side by side, as they had always been in life. Adelaide and Sarah clung to their children, who stood bewildered, watching as the world that had mocked and stared at their fathers now turned solemn, if only for an afternoon. Some spoke kind words, acknowledging the men as hard-working farmers, as fathers who had raised large families, as neighbours who, despite their strangeness, had lived decently among them. Others whispered still, unable to separate the memory of the brothers from the spectacle that had defined them for so long. Their resting place became a quiet marker, a patch of land where stone and soil bore witness to lives lived under the harshest scrutiny. For years, children in the community dared one another to visit the graves, to stand before the markers in the night and whisper the names of the Siamese twins. The burial ground, meant to bring peace, became another stage for legend, a place woven into the folklore of the county. Some claimed to hear whispers near the graves at dusk, as if the brothers' voices still carried faintly through the trees. Yet for their families, the graves were a place of mourning and remembrance. The children visited often, leaving flowers, speaking to fathers who had never been granted the dignity of privacy in life. Here, at least, they could claim some measure of it in death, though even then visitors came from distant towns to glimpse the final resting place of the world's most famous twins. Chang and Eng had lived as spectacle, died as spectacle, and even in burial remained symbols of fascination. Their graves marked not only the end of their lives, but also the beginning of a legend that would outlive them. It did not take long for stories to grow around the graves of Chang and Eng Bunker. In Wilkes County, their presence lingered not only in memory, but in whispers passed from one generation to the next. Children dared one another to approach the burial site after sundown, convinced that the spirits of the brothers would rise together, still tethered by the strip of flesh that had bound them in life. Some claimed that on quiet nights, if one stood near the graves, the faint sound of breathing could be heard, as though two men were struggling for air just beneath the soil. Others swore they saw movement, shadows crossing in tandem at the edge of the cemetery, vanishing when approached. Neighbors told stories of hearing footsteps along country roads, the sound doubled as if two men walked side by side. Farmers spoke of seeing twin silhouettes in the mist, figures whose bodies were never quite separate. Such tales blurred quickly into legend, the ordinary grief of a family transformed into eerie folklore that colored the community's memory of the brothers. What had been a life of scandal and spectacle became, in death, a haunting. Even the farmhouse where they died became a site of uneasy fascination. Visitors claimed the rooms still carried an oppressive weight, as if the terror of Eng's final hours had imprinted itself on the very air. Some said they heard knocking at the walls, or a man's voice calling faintly in desperation, echoing the pleas Eng had cried after finding his brother lifeless beside him. Though the family tried to live on, the house became another focal point for rumor, another place for locals to spin tales that blurred tragedy into ghost story. The children of Chang and Eng bore the weight of these stories as much as they had borne the ridicule of their fathers' lives. At school, whispers followed them, mocking their heritage and their name. While they grew into men and women who carved out lives of their own, they could never fully escape the legacy of the spectacle, nor the folklore that continued to feed upon their family history. Folklore often outlives fact, and in Wilkes County, the legend of the Siamese Twins became less about who they were and more about what they represented. The uncanny, the unsettling, the boundary between the natural and the unnatural. In death, as in life, the world refused to let them rest. Though their graves grew quiet, the names of Chang and Eng Bunker lived on in ways that neither they nor their families could control. In the decades that followed their deaths, the phrase Siamese Twins entered common language, used by doctors, journalists, and ordinary people alike whenever conjoined siblings were mentioned. What had once been the personal story of two men became a label stamped across medical texts, circus posters, and casual conversation. The term reduced every case of conjoined twins to a single reference point, as if no others had existed before or after. Chang and Eng had become less men and more a definition. Medical journals preserved them as specimens of curiosity, reprinting drawings of their bodies, diagrams of their fused organs, and case studies that treated their humanity as secondary to the fascination of their anatomy. For generations of doctors, their story was less about their struggles as husbands and fathers and more about what could be learned from their deaths. Students memorized their case, sometimes never knowing that they had left behind children, grandchildren, and descendants who carried their legacy in far more ordinary ways. Beyond medicine, their image seeped into popular culture. Novelists used Siamese twins as metaphors for inescapable bonds. Cartoonists mocked politicians by drawing them tethered together like the brothers, trapped in unity. The phrase became shorthand for unnatural closeness, often used with ridicule. The Bunkers' lives, filled with work, family, triumph, and sorrow, were forgotten beneath a metaphor the world found too convenient to abandon. Yet their legacy was not only one of exploitation. For some, the brothers came to symbolize resilience, the ability to endure in the face of mockery, to build lives when the world denied them dignity. Their descendants, scattered across North Carolina and beyond, carried pride in their ancestry, pointing to the fact that two men once dismissed as freaks had fathered 21 children and founded families whose bloodlines reached far into the future. Still, the weight of the name remained. Even today, when medical science has replaced the crude label with more clinical terms, Siamese Twins lingers in popular imagination. It is a reminder of how deeply the world consumed the story of Chang and Eng, not as individuals, but as symbols of the uncanny. Their legacy was written less in their own voices than in the voices of those who stared at them, dissected them, and turned them into an eternal curiosity. In the end, the story of Chang and Eng Bunker is not only about two brothers bound in flesh, but about how the world chose to see them. To their neighbors, they were curiosities to be whispered about. To doctors, they were specimens, puzzles waiting to be solved by scalpel and ink. To preachers, they were a moral problem, proof of divine mystery or divine punishment. And to the crowds who paid admission to see them, they were little more than marvels, half men paraded across a stage. Yet beyond all of this, they were simply men, husbands, fathers, laborers, who tried to carve out ordinary lives under extraordinary circumstances. They loved, they quarreled, they raised children, they endured. Their humanity was never erased, only hidden behind the fascination and cruelty of those who refused to see it. Their deaths answered the question that had haunted them all their lives. What would happen if one died before the other? The answer was as inevitable as it was tragic. The bond that tethered them in life tethered them in death, pulling Eng into the grave alongside Chang. Even so, the world would not let them rest. Their bodies were cut open, their names turned into a label, their lives transformed into metaphor. To this day, they remain immortal not for who they truly were, but for what the world decided they represented. So what were they, really? Were they monsters, as some whispered, marvels of nature, as others declared? Or were they, perhaps most unsettling of all, a mirror, showing us our own hunger for spectacle, our willingness to strip others of dignity in order to satisfy curiosity? The truth is both haunting and uncomfortable. Chang and Eng were men like any others, but the world insisted on making them something else, something that could never be allowed peace. Their story lingers as a reminder of how thin the line is between fascination and cruelty, between wonder and exploitation. And it leaves us with a question. When we look upon those who are different, do we see people, or do we see only the story we want them to tell? If this story unsettled you as much as it unsettled us, be sure to subscribe to the Macabre Record. It helps us continue to bring forgotten and haunting histories into the light. And before you go, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight?